Welcome to this edition of On Politics. I'm Dr. Eric Morrow, coming to you from the campus of Tarleton State University on KTRL 90.5 FM. And so I want to welcome you to this another week, another show, and also to thank you for those that regularly listen, whether that's right here at the noon hour on Sunday, or it's through a podcast or through SoundCloud. Our previous episodes are available, and the reason why I mention that is not a self-promotion as much here as talk about what we've been doing over the past 6 weeks, and that is bringing in people from our Tarleton community and from the region and beyond to look at a number of different facets of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on our society, on our communities, on our state. And so what I wanted to start today, the show, we do not have a special guest today, so I'll let you know that. It's a kind of a break from that interview cycle, but we will certainly get back to that in the weeks ahead. But what I wanted to do was to go back to those interviews and just talk about some of the implications, some of the things that we've learned in speaking with a wide range of professionals and experts in different areas, and how that helps us to understand where we are today, right now, in relation to this crisis. And so if you remember, we started out this series speaking with Dr. Dustin Edwards, a faculty member at Tarleton State, who talked to us a little bit about the science of the virus and helping us to understand how this thing's being looked at, understood, learning what we know, or trying to learn more things about it as we go along, with the hopes for a vaccine, with the hopes of good public safety, sound public safety advice to help people going forward, especially now if we look at opening back up businesses and the economy and eventually maybe schools and so on, churches, other places of worship, the challenges that we're going to encounter in having this still very present and very real and having an impact. So that's something that's very critical, and we'll get back to that here in just a moment. If you remember, if you've been following us, the next week we had Travis Stillwell, the superintendent from Tolar ISD, talking about the impact on public education. We followed that with Jeff Sanford and Bill Leverton, Jeff from the Stephenville Economic Development Authority, and Bill from the Small Business Development Center, talking about economic issues both here in our community of Stephenville, in the region, and around the state. We also had Dr. Samantha Pell speaking with us about the public health implications and challenges with this. And then we wrapped this up, and as you can see, this was a very diverse series of interviews, but we wrapped it up with the heads of both major political parties in the state of Texas, James Dickey, the chairman of the Republican Party of Texas, and Gilberto Hinojosa, the chair of the Texas Democratic Party. And what I see is very interesting about bringing these people together and having these discussions, and now looking back and summarizing all of this, is that I think there's some very clear things that we can see that are both challenges, opportunities, information that we need to be aware of. But in terms of this show, with our focus being very much on politics, it's understanding all of these within that role of government and how it relates to us, how it's addressing these issues, how government, both local or including local, state, and federal government, is engaging on the policy level, on the response level to the challenges created by this crisis. And so I wanted to go through in this first segment of the show several of these areas and look ahead based on what we heard from each of these people that we have interviewed. I think if we go back to the interview with Dr. Dustin Edwards, we very much see, and again, this is reaffirmed on a daily basis with the reports about the coronavirus and how it's being addressed, is that there's still a lot we don't know. We are learning and experiencing things, new things every day. And the dimensions of this are changing in that as areas of the country are opening back up, and how do we watch the numbers? How do we look at the spread of this and what's happening around the country, and understanding how that is happening and occurring. So the challenge here, I think one of the major challenges, and I was just thinking about this the last few days, is I'm myself missing baseball. I mean, this is the time of the year when we're engaged in the early part of the season and seeing whether this is a playoff year or not for the team that we like. But we have a culture, we have a society that is built around a number and wide range of engagements. And what I mean by that is that there are so many different opportunities that are both recreational, that are entertaining, that we think are important in enhancing our lives, and we engage with those in multiple ways on a regular basis. And now all of a sudden, because of this closing down of our society, our freedom of movement, our ability to congregate, that's had a tremendous impact. It's not just economic in terms of the resources that are spent on in these areas, but it's also a kind of changing culture, challenging our culture in the way we behave, the way we act, the way we do, what we do with our time and with our resources. And so I think this is very, very challenging at this point. And so one of the things that we see in conflict here is that manner in which we live and the manner in which we engage with the world around us and the things that we like to go and do uh, with science and with a direction that a scientific look at this and finding out what works and doesn't work and what we need to do to be safe, and learning that and applying it. And so there is a very direct conflict there. And we see that even more so now than ever with these moves of groups around the country to kind of force a reopening of states, in addition to just the angst that we may all have of saying, okay, this is long enough. There's not many cases around me. I'm stuck in my house. I want to get out. I want to go. I want to do things. So it's manifesting itself in so many different ways. And I think one of the things that we have to be very, very cautious about in this period as we move forward, and as we know that there's still many more consequences and challenges that are ahead of us, is we really have to look at what is being learned by doctors and by researchers that will help us to navigate the weeks and months ahead. I think that is so very, very critical. We just can't let our what we call cultural norms and our activities and behaviors supersede what we're learning about this, because in the end, what's in the balance is our lives and the well-being of so many people. And so I think what we learned and heard there from Dr. Edwards was that this is going to be a very challenging process. This is not something that we can put some information into a computer and overnight we have answers and solutions. This takes time. It takes time to analyze all of this data, to see what's happening around the world, to see the consequences, to work in understanding the biology that's here and how we counter that in terms of the impact of the infection and immunity for it. All of that takes time to develop. And so one of the things here is patience. It's listening, it's finding out, okay, what do we need to do based on that knowledge that we're gaining to protect ourselves, to protect lives, to heal the sick, help people overcome this if they've contracted it. And so that I think is very critical when we look at this ahead, and not to ignore that. And hopefully, and one of the things that we need to advocate is that our government officials are not ignoring that as well. That we've seen some calls by some people that for the sake of our economy, that we've just got to continue to move forward. We've got to get people out. We've got to get people buying again and doing and so on. That is critical. And that is a response that has to be addressed in some way. And we'll get to that in a moment. But on the other hand, we've got to find the balance in there in maintaining safety, protecting lives, and ensuring that the medical care is there that people need, as well as supporting the research that is ongoing on this to find secure, safe countermeasures in order to address the virus and its spread and the fact that it may be with us for a long time. So when we look back to at the interview we had with Travis Stillwell, and we look ahead in terms of public education, this is an area where people are really wrestling with what needs to be done in the months ahead to be prepared for millions of school children and college students and young people to be back in an educational environment. And how do you do this? I know right here at Tarleton State, we're wrestling with this in terms of use of space and safety measures and so on to ensure the highest level of safety for our student community and our faculty and so on as we move into the fall semester. But you look at this at the public education level and you see some significant challenges, and that is the how do they adapt to an environment where social distancing may be necessary or a mask have to be worn. What are the options that they have there with sometimes limited resources and limited space? And so I think this is going to be consume a lot of time over the summer of school administrators and even the general public. I think in some of the things, and we'll get to this a little later in the show when we talk about the general election and voting in the fall, but I think there's some of these things that are going to have to very much be community efforts. So, what is it going to take for a school in a community to be back doing what it needs to do to educate students and to provide a safe educational environment? And some of that may be outside the limitations of personnel and resources of those school districts or of those individual schools. So I think it's very critical here that for all of us that we stay engaged with that. What is needed on the local level to facilitate the education of our children and youth? How can we contribute to helping get things ready and be ready? And some people may not be thinking about that right now when everybody's been teaching their children at home. They've been struggling through this balancing jobs or not, depending on what the status of that is. But then trying to continue that education process outside of that school environment, and that's been very challenging. It's going to be very challenging in that environment in the fall as well. And I think that's where we need to be ready and be prepared to kind of answer the call of how do we help our schools and our teachers and our administrators be ready for what they need to accomplish in the months ahead in order to be able to have that safe, productive environment in our schools in the fall. We turn next to the economic picture, and we had great guests. Jeff Sanford and Bill Leverton were with us, and we really focused here at the local level on our economic progress and just what seemed to be happening here with construction continuing and people engaging with the local economy. We look at that on a regional level. We know that rural Texas has not been impacted quite as much. And part of that is the number of cases, but part of that is the early sheltering in place, people staying at home, social distancing. We are seeing that change in some places, but not dramatically like we're seeing in other metropolitan areas. But we have to realize that this is and already is having an economic impact, both short and long term. And how we respond to this is going to be critical, but more importantly is how our local and state officials respond to this. That is going to be very critical. And what I mean by short term is we're just now seeing the numbers of the impact. So prior to the show, I made sure to pull up here the revenue watch that's available from the state comptroller online. And what we've seen just in the last few months is a small, back in March, we had a small drop in general revenue, but that drop then was significant in April. And so with the April reports out, we saw like a 10% drop in sales tax. We saw significant drops, and we're talking in the 40% plus in insurance taxes, oil production tax, cigarette and tobacco taxes, natural gas production. All categories are showing significant drops over this time last year. and just in the months. And so what we were seeing, and just to give you summarize this in a way, is up through January of this year, we continued to see revenue increases, significant revenue increase across all areas of general revenue for the state. And so coming into the year, the economic picture looked really good. It looked really not just on track, but ahead in terms of the gains that we were making due to oil production, due to population growth, and the growth in the economic infrastructure of the state. That changed, of course, in March with the beginnings of closing down certain businesses, with the impact on schools, the impact on retail, and so on. And so we're starting to see that impact. It saw it by the end of April. The hope was that opening up the economy, opening up businesses would help to mitigate some of that in May. We won't know until the end of the month. But what we saw in April was a substantial drop. And just to give you an idea in terms of dollars, just in looking at the uh, April sales tax revenue for the state, in January we had over 3 billion in sales tax collected, and in April that had dropped to 2.5 billion. So a $500 million drop in from January compared to January in terms of sales tax revenue. So this is having an impact, and we haven't had a decision by state lawmakers yet on cutting the state budget in this current cycle, but we can anticipate that that is coming. And I think what they're waiting on, and they're evaluating, is to seeing, can this rev back up? Can we get back on track, at least in some way? That cut in state revenue, that drop in state revenue, will be limited, and that the cuts to state services will not be quite as deep. We just don't know at this point. I think it's something that is being watched very closely. We do have a constitutional amendment that requires us to balance our revenue with the budget, our revenue forecast. I think it's coming, in that the governor, lieutenant governor, and the Speaker of the House consult with each other in determining the level of the cut, and they're required constitutionally to move forward with that to make sure that the state is not deficit spending. So on the one hand, and I've taught Texas government for years, I kind of look at this in a positive way. There's other challenges and issues about our revenue structure that we can delve into at another time. But I look at this in a positive way, is that with Texas having that restriction on deficit spending, it ensures that the state going into a crisis like this is not always saddled with heavy debts that it can't meet. In fact, it's required by law to cut the budget to meet whatever the actual revenue is that's coming in. So that's a side of it that puts us in a time of crisis, maybe in a little better shape. Now, remember, we spend less per capita on government than any other state. So any cuts in Texas to our budget are going to hurt. They're going to cut into essential services. And so that is what we have to look forward to. That's the negative side of this, that the challenge is going to be where those cuts come and when. Sometimes they're across the board, except for very essential services like law enforcement and our prisons and other areas that are critical to day-to-day state operations in terms of public safety and so forth. But they will be coming, and I think one of the things that we need to think about in this, and certainly hoping for the best in the recovery of the economy, but that going into the next legislative cycle, what is the long-term impact going to be? The short term, we've been through this before. We go through this about every 10 years as a state. There's some crisis, something that impacts. The last time it was a national recession that eventually impacted Texas, and we have to deal with these crises financially in terms of its impact on the economy. But I think what we're looking at long term is what will this look like in the next budget cycle? So we'll be entering the second year of the budget cycle that was set by the last legislature that met in January to May of 2019. our next legislature will meet January 2021, and part of their responsibility will be to prepare a budget for the next 2 years after that. And so this is going to be a very critical time because it's going to impact what that budget picture is going to look like. So part of this is not to be on this to be doom and gloom and so on. It's the focus here is our awareness of how this works and what the short and long term impact will be. Moving on to public health, I think in our interview with Dr. Pell, we saw some of the challenges that we see on health systems, on the medical community, both public and private. We don't have a huge public health system in the state. We've relied a lot on private health care, but what we see is that this can become a significant challenge. Some of the impact has been on wellness care over this period of time, where we've had about 6 weeks of people not maybe seeking the care that they actually need because of concerns with the virus. We've seen the impact across the nation on supplies and equipment. We've seen the impact on the physical, emotional well-being of our medical care personnel. And so pushing this forward, a big focus now is on adaptability and readiness. And so as we monitor the state cases and how the virus is, what's its status in different areas now as things are opening up, and we're just now entering kind of that 2-week period past the initial stages of opening up the state. And so we've certainly seen cases start to rise. They've not risen dramatically yet. That's and we hope that they don't. I mean, I'm not here advocating that, but we certainly have seen a rise in cases in our metropolitan areas. And so the critical questions in terms of public health is, are we ready? Are we ready to handle the numbers of hospitalizations and cases? Right now, hospitalizations are very low. I think the Department of Health Services has it at around 1,800 hospitalizations related to COVID-19. So that's a fairly low number given the healthcare infrastructure of the state, but that may certainly increase in the weeks and months ahead, or it may not in the short term, and then it may, when we get into the fall, into the flu season, and seeing how this virus, what happens with it at that time. So public health system certainly is impacted, and our concern needs to be looking at that in terms of the directives that are coming from state and local and federal governments in the weeks ahead. The last area that we included in this series of interviews was our discussions with both chairpersons of each political party, the major political parties in the state, and that focus was really on how they had adapted during this election cycle. The fact that in the middle of the cycle, post Super Tuesday, in the middle of a primary leading up to conventions in the summer, that the election process and campaign process had really been turned upside down. So now runoff elections were postponed, campaigning moves online, it moves to telephone campaigning. And so this change necessitated quick adaptation to how these parties are handling their state conventions. We talked about the Democrats going to a virtual convention and the Republicans still having their convention scheduled for later this summer and in July. So right now, that's where it stands. Both indicated the impact on campaigns. Both indicated and emphasized the importance of the election in November. Gilberto Hinojosa, the chair of the Democratic Party of Texas, focused and gave attention to their efforts to increase voting options, specifically voting by mail for the fall election. We've already seen Governor Abbott increase the window of voting for the runoff elections in July, and we can anticipate that may happen in the fall as well. We also, just this past week, had an appeals court ruling that allowed the expansion of voting by mail for the upcoming election. And so the Texas Tribune reported on this in talking about, or in stating that a state appeals court upheld a temporary order Thursday that could greatly expand the number of voters who qualify for mail-in ballots during the coronavirus pandemic. The 14th Court of Appeals of Texas said it would let stand State District Judge Tim Sulak's ruling from last month that susceptibility to the coronavirus counts as a disability under state election law and is a legally valid reason for voters to request absentee ballots. Now, the State Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has challenged this. He's been fighting this ruling, and it will most likely move on and be appealed by the state to the Texas Supreme Court. But right now, it's in place, and the focus here is broadening the access to mail voting for people who can identify that they have a susceptibility to the coronavirus. So they can just state that on there. I have a susceptibility. I don't want to risk the possibility of catching this by going and voting. And so I want to use the option for an absentee ballot. So this is one avenue, one step. And of course, the leadership of the Democratic Party in Texas is advocating even for broader, just opening this up in order to allow voting by mail. The challenge with that, certainly as we discussed, was the size of our state, the fact that we may have over 11 million people voting in November in the fall election. And how do you secure the integrity of that system? And so I'm not really here today. I don't want to bring this in as a topic of debate on whether or not we should move to that level of voting by mail, as much as pointing out some of the things that we need to be concerned about as we look to the fall election. And I've mentioned some of these on a previous show, but I wanted to emphasize this here in light of our series of interviews and really kind of expanding this into looking at the general election. And so in the second segment of the show today, emphasizing voting, talking about this transition or expansion of mail voting, I think two things that are very critical for this fall election. One is that state leaders and party leaders should be working and focused primarily on the integrity of our system of voting. That has to be protected above all cost, or at all costs, I should say here, because here we are in a time of national and world crisis. And the last thing that we need in a time that already lends itself to instability is to have an election process go awry, to have an election process that is fumbled, and thus the outcome becomes questionable, and thus that leads to further potential for further political instability. I mean, that's moving down a road that we don't want to go, that we don't want to see greater and very significant challenges to our system of governance because we're not prepared to conduct a general election in this environment. And so I think the integrity of the system is so critical. And whether that means that we need to provide additional options and in those options ensure integrity, that's what we have to be looking at. And this is where the challenge for state and party leaders is to kind of come together around this and to say, well, if we need more options in order to provide a higher level of public safety for the elections, then perhaps we need more voting places. We need a mixed process here where you may not have enough voting machines to cover more voting places, but we can go back to it wasn't too long ago that we were using the pencil and the ballots that you just filled out by hand. Can we have mixed systems in places? Can we look at expanding mail or the other voting by mail? Or the other option or another part of this would be more time, not just a lengthier period for absentee balloting, but more days on which to vote, and emphasizing those days and encouraging as many people as possible to vote early Or one thing that we talked about with Mr. Hinojosa was a voting holiday, having Tuesday as a day, that election day, November 3rd, to have it as a holiday where people are off work and can go and vote. I think those are things that are doable that we can look at short term, because one of the things that came out of those conversations with both gentlemen is the issue with polls and polling workers, the health of polling workers, people who are there all day operating those polls, people who are gone through the training that they need, but also many of them being over 65, possibly having some health conditions that may compromise them and make them susceptible to the virus. Also, it was pointed out that the number of people volunteering and being prepared and trained for this, that number is very low right now compared to previous election cycles. And so I think one of the things that state officials and party leaders need to do is to engage the broader public. So a work holiday here may make available more people who are not as susceptible to the virus to be able to volunteer, be trained, and be prepared to work in a polling site. So this is where these are the critical things: the integrity of the system, and then facilitating voting in a manner that will protect people's lives, that will protect, will encourage public safety, the highest level of safety for people, knowing that it's going to take more time if social distancing rules are in place at a time of the year when this virus may resurge and we have more cases maybe than we even have now. We hope that will not be the case. But right now, in the trajectory of this, we have to be concerned about that, and we have to be making those preparations now, especially when we're looking at accommodating that many voters. So I hope this helps in going back and reviewing what we've heard and what we've talked about over the last 6 weeks in terms of impact, and really kind of looking ahead based on those conversations. And I would encourage you to look up On Politics with Eric Morrow on SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts, and listen back at these interviews, and then bring it together like we've done today to help you engage and understand some of these critical issues that are being impacted by the virus, critical issues that involve policy, that involve government at all levels, and how that government is being responsive to these issues and needs and challenges, and how we're planning and adapting for what we need to do in the months ahead, as well as looking at how we continue to maintain the strength and the trust we have in our voting process, the reliance that we have on services that government provides, and how we at times too move past the politics of all of this to really look at what the central issues are and how we can work together to resolve them. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back in segment 3 of the show, we're going to talk a little bit about follow up on an interview I had on AM News Radio in Cincinnati this past week on the general election and how the accusations of Tara Reade related to Joe Biden are impacting that election process. So we'll be right back after the break.
T for Texas is a Texas-based history podcast from historian Dr. T. Lindsay Baker. Find a new episode every Thursday morning wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to On Politics. We're glad you're joining us today, and we hope you engage with that first segment of the show focused on an overview of the interviews that we've done over the last 6 weeks. And we turn now back to the general election. We've talked about that some, but I had the opportunity, it'll be a week ago, to interview on WLW 700 AM radio in Cincinnati, and talking about the Tara Reade accusations to Joe Biden. So these accusations that back when she worked in his Senate office, that in the early 90s, that she was assaulted by Joe Biden. And so she's come out with these accusations, ones which some have confirmed that they heard at the time or shortly after the event itself. And so the interview was not so much focused, and that's not what I do here. And what we do on the show is get into well, is she right or wrong, or what happened or what didn't happen, and so on. A lot of that would be speculation on my part, but the other side of it is the impact of that. And so we're looking at the impact on the race to the White House, on Joe Biden standing as the presumptive candidate of the Democratic Party for the presidency. And then also the secondary question that I talked about in that interview was the media's response. And so we'll start there, because that was the initial focus, was why was the media so delayed in looking at this when the accusation itself, some of this had come out last fall. It seemed to ramp up even more in March and into April. But it seemed like that the media coverage of this was not being received at the level that we look back and we talk about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and the issues there, and the claims that were being making, the accusations that were being made, that this was certainly not given that kind of attention. What I want to point out here are a couple of things that are kind of interesting, because this is very much about politics and very much about how this works within that political realm, and not in terms of politics as an ideal and the different ways that can be looked at. I'm talking about the real kind of nuts and bolts and the way some of this actually works, and can be sometimes challenging to us in understanding it, because we look at it on different levels and in different ways. But when you get into this political sphere, these things become a little more convoluted, a little more challenging. The focus on them becomes a little more complex. And so my attention to this was looking at where this is happening in terms of issues that are overshadowing the election itself, not just these accusations, but just the election process. And we've talked about that on the show just as recently in talking with the party chairs in the state of Texas. And that is that this pandemic has consumed so much of the news cycle and so much of the media's attention that's one aspect of it. It's not the only, because we do know that, and we can look at this, that even media has ideological directives, guidance in that how they approach things and what they give attention to, some more so than others. But the focus here, one of the things that really kind of pushes this to the side, is that not only the time, how long ago it happened, but the fact that there is so much more that is on the minds of the people of this country right now. And so they're just not engaged at that level. Certainly there are people that are engaged, that are involved in the election process, that are engaged with the parties, but the rank and file person is not deeply engaged with the election cycle, because they're concerned about the impact on the economy, their jobs, their health, their families, their freedom to move around and do and go do what they want to do. And so I think this is very critical to understand how this is playing. The other part of this was a question about why such an intensive engagement with it by Democrats during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings as compared to what's happening now, and why this kind of almost seems like an about face. And I think we can't just interpret that always in terms of consistency in terms of action and attitude toward particular events. And this is a characteristic of politics in general, of real politics, where that there are other factors that are controlling how people respond and engage with a specific situation. So when we look back at the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, we see Democrats definitely engaged because this is a nominee by President Trump, a Republican, This is a nomination process is being guided through the Senate by Republicans who have control of the Senate. This is something that gives them cause and reason to engage and say, hey, wait a minute, we want to show this up against other things that we've identified related to President Trump or to the character and quality of his nominees. And so it is a political opportunity, no matter what the moral or ethical engagement is. It's a very much a political opportunity for position. And so this is very clear, I think, in this response to the Tara Reade allegations, is that we look at the Democratic Party process. We see that Biden has become the presumptive nominee. We see a very low number of Democrats who think that Biden should be replaced with another candidate. And of course, who would that be? Who among the other candidates or anyone else that would have the positioning that Biden has now based on the primary process to be able to be competitive? Because this is not, we have to realize this is not about as much about the quality of the person. This is at this point, I think that has to be considered, and it has to be considered by us when we vote. But it's about winning. It's about putting the person in a position who has the best possibility of winning the election. And so to make that change now would be very detrimental to that, because then you're talking about either someone who is already in the race that has left because Biden had the surge that he did, beginning with South Carolina and following through Super Tuesday, and them having to build that rapport on a national level. And who do you have that could come to the forefront at this moment and be able to gain that momentum that they need to carry them in to the election? So that is certainly not a possibility. And with the positioning here, you're not going to have Democrats coming out and applying the same analysis and the same criteria to their own candidate that they would to someone of the other party. The second thing that we have to look at here is public opinion. Public opinion still overall, when we look at the polling, it shows that Biden is maintaining a lead. He has a 9-point lead in the national polls. He's leading in swing counties and swing states for the most part. And it shows at this point that public opinion is showing that this has limited effect on Biden as a candidate. And so again, when you're talking about positioning for winning the election, it's a no-brainer politically. Okay, you're not even thinking about, okay, did this happen? Did it not, or whatever? As Biden, should this impact his aspirations to be president of the United States? Those aren't even valid questions, because the trajectory is toward that election and toward winning the White House. And then the third one is this is all wrapped up, and this is very much about politics, and that is the quest for power. We have to very much understand, especially at this level, but it happens even at the state and local level, that people are in politics for a wide range of reasons. Some of those reasons may be very altruistic. That may be that they're there because they want to serve their fellow human beings. They may be there because they want to represent the interest and views of their constituency. But there is also a very strong component of power that plays into this at varying degrees. And it really depends on the person, and it depends on the opportunity, the positioning that they have in order to gain power. And so when you put all these things together, the quest for power to win an election like this, to be able to wake up the next morning and you're the president of the United States, when you talk about public opinion and the impact that this is having, and then when you look at positioning within the party and the potential outcome of this, it's really not a question of the impact of this and trying to address it. So as long as that positioning remains and public opinion holds steady, there's just not going to be that impact of this on the Biden campaign. And then we wonder about where it'll be when we roll into the debates and so on. It's part of it on my part. Now, again, I don't know how their strategists are going to handle this, and we'll just have to see when we get there. But I don't know that Trump has any kind of standing to be able to go after Biden on this matter. We already went through the 2016 cycle, and we saw all the things that came up in terms of Trump and his behavior and his comments and his actions, and none of that really derailed his campaign. He was still able to get through the campaign and win the election. I don't know that a valid strategy for Trump in the debates is to go after Biden on this. I think that's something that they're going to have to seriously look at because Biden could just as easily counter with not just one issue, but multiple issues that would question Trump's character. So I think what we're going to see is that this is going to slowly fade from the news cycle, and we may not hear of it again in the months ahead. And the only reason we may hear of it is in certain areas of the media that want to continue to follow this issue and try to push it in some way to influence voters and whether they vote for Biden or not. So we will see. I mean, this is an interesting dynamic to see and how this plays out within the election. I want to wrap up the show today just with a quick segment on talking about the coronavirus, the pandemic, and politics. So we've hinted all around this because in all the things we've talked about, there's some political aspect. But I just wanted to take us through this. And as the show is on politics, we know that there is a definite political impact of so many aspects of our world, our society, our nation, and even our communities with this. And what I wanted to do for you just briefly was talk about the different levels of government that we're following, we're watching, or engaging with in this virus, in this pandemic, and look at what we may see in terms of politics and how politics play into the way that each level of government addresses the way forward in the pandemic. So when we start with the local level, I think one of the things, and we don't see many times unless we're talking with our neighbors or we're having a cup of coffee with someone or we're listening to local radio like this, that we hear about what's going on locally. But for our local political leaders and officials, the critical issues here are going to be how they follow the directives of the state. We've already seen some conflict with that in certain areas, in large metropolitan areas where you have a county commissioner or county judge or someone decide in a certain way that's contrary to the directives of the state. And so that's going to be an area of political tension that we're going to see in certain places going forward. I think the real issue and challenge for local officials is how to handle the healthcare challenges, the capacity of medical facilities, combating the methods and ways in which the virus is spread. How do they address that? And so what we can certainly see going forward is there is going to be this tension in some parts of the state between local officials and what they're trying to do to navigate this and the directives that are coming from Austin, because we know the virus is impacting different areas in different ways. Places with low cases, much more likely to follow the directives directly. Places with high numbers of cases, much more likely to kind of counter those directives and try to limit and limit the number of cases and deaths. On the state level, again, there's certainly going to be concern for capacity. How do we provide adequate medical care for the people who have the virus that need additional care and possibly hospitalization? But the political part of this is how the state responds to the direction of the virus. Because it's one thing to get on a track to saying, hey, look, we're just going to plow forward no matter what. We're going to move forward with the economy and all of this no matter what happens. Well, we're hoping that the virus doesn't intensify, but what if it does? and how our state leaders going to respond to that. Because in one sense, if it does, some of them are going to be having to say, okay, we were wrong. We need to slow this down a little bit. And we need to be more cautious and careful moving forward. And so that's going to certainly be a challenge. And then the other side for state officials will be the economic challenge. And that is, how do we deal with the short and long-term economic impact? And how is that going to resonate with voters? How is that going to, how are they going to be engaged in seeing that, especially as we go into a legislative session? Finally, the federal level, this has been very much political, as we've seen. A lot of it is focused on the optics of it, how this is playing for President Trump among his base, how it's playing nationally. But really, the political is going to get very much wrapped up in the economic challenges that are going to persist, both short and long term, and how the nation is dealing with this. Then it also bleeds over into an election cycle. So the fact that we are in an election cycle makes the federal response very political. It makes it, every move can be critiqued by the other side. Every action, every word can become fodder for the opposing party in terms of the election and leading to the general election. So those are a few things. We'll get more in depth on some of those in the weeks ahead. But I want to thank you today for joining us for this episode of On Politics. You can join us right here on KTRL 90.5 FM each week at noon. And I encourage you to do so, or to follow us on Facebook, listen on SoundCloud, or where you download your podcast. This is Eric Morrow, and I look forward to being back with you again next week right here at noon on 90.5 FM.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from AJ Heyer and Taylor Welch. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.